Well, good evening and welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you all here this evening. And it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome our guest of honor and speaker, Tom Shroder. Tom was part of a particularly shimmering moment in my own life. This was in Miami in the early 1980s, and it was centered around the Miami Herald and particularly the Sunday magazine, Tropic magazine, where Tom was one of the principal editors. Now this was a moment, and I know we all succumb to the temptation, the older we get, the better we were. But this was truly a moment. There was Tom, there was Dave Barry, Carl Hiaasen, Madeline Blaze, John Katzenbach, with assists from the likes of Paul Levine and Elmore Leonard. It was a moment of creativity, of innovation, and of kind of daring, editorial daring. And it was a pleasure to be part of that, or at least to be able to watch that. The ringmasters were Gene Weingarten, who went on to win multiple Pulitzer Prizes at the Post, and Tom Shroder. I was only peripherally involved. I was occasionally invited to sit at the cool kids table, but I certainly could admire them from afar. The Herald folded Tropic a few years later, which is a reminder to the younger people here that the newspaper industry was in advanced decrepitude long before the digital revolution finished them off. And Hiaasen and Katzenbach went on to write books and get rich. Dave Barry won his Pulitzer Prize or his Nobel Prize, I've lost track. And Gene and Tom Shroder went to the Washington Post and continued to work their magic there. As an editor, Tom conceived and edited 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning feature stories, including Fatal Distraction, which Gene wrote, which is a devastating story about the aftermath of horribly tragic instances when people leave small children in cars and they die because of heat. Tom went on to launch a widely syndicated comic strip, The Cul-de-sac, and edited Bridget Schulte's best-selling book, Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When Nobody Has the Time. As an author in his own right, Tom co-wrote Fire on the Horizon, the untold story of the Gulf oil disaster. His work, The Hunt for Bin Laden, edited from 15 years of coverage by the Washington Post, became the #1 selling Kindle single on Amazon. And he also wrote by himself an extraordinary book, which I have recommended many times to people, a book called Old Souls, Compelling Evidence from Children Who Remember Past Lives. I know this sounds like an unlikely subject. It sounds like a fringe and it's sort of a goofy subject, but it is totally riveting. Tom followed the 4 decades of inquiries by a University of Virginia psychiatrist into cases of people who appear to have been born with the memories and personalities of individuals who are recently deceased, apparent instances of reincarnation. And the book is amazing. I couldn't recommend it too strongly. Well, Tom is here to talk about his latest book, Acid Test, which chronicles the attempts to win acceptance for the use of psychedelics, chiefly LSD and MDMA, for psychotherapy, especially to fight the epidemic that we now face of post-traumatic stress. It's a tremendous pleasure to have Tom here tonight, and I introduce him to you now.
Oh, thank you, Ed. Very nice introduction. Well, thank you all for coming out. I hope you all sign the sign-in sheet because we want to make sure we know who the people were that came out to just talk about drugs after school. Really why we're here, or why I'm here writing about this book, is because a man named Albert Hofmann in 1945 stumbled on one of the most remarkable discoveries in history. And he's an interesting story because when he was a Swiss citizen, and as a child, a young boy really, he remembered having these sort of remarkable spontaneous experiences. And let me just read what he had to say about this. One day when he was 12 years old, he was walking through a path in the forest. And he said, all at once, everything appeared in an uncommonly clear light. Was this something I had simply failed to notice before? Was I suddenly discovering the spring forest as it actually looked? It shone with the most beautiful radiance, speaking to the heart as though it wanted to encompass me in its majesty. I was filled with an indescribable sensation of joy, oneness, and blissful security. I became convinced of the existence of a miraculous, powerful, unfathomable reality that was hidden from everyday sight. He said, I was often troubled in those days, knowing that I was not cut out to be a poet or an artist. I assumed I would have to keep these experiences to myself, important as they were to me. So one of the great and little-known ironies of history is that instead of becoming a poet and a scientist so he could express this ineffable experience that he had, he became a scientist, a chemist. And this was in the early days of the 20th century, and he was working in these poorly ventilated labs with, you know, all sorts of toxic chemicals, et cetera. And it was about as far from being a poet as you could possibly be. But instead of learning how to describe these experiences, he stumbled on a substance that would actually create them so that anybody who took it might have one of these experiences themselves. And what happened was he was working with a substance well, basically Sandoz. This was Sandoz Chemical, a Swiss company. And its chemistry department was founded on discovering uses for a substance called ergotamine, which came from a rye fungus. And this rye fungus, unbeknownst to people for hundreds of years, had been killing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people during the Middle Ages, and they didn't even know it. What happened was that rye would be harvested, and then it would get tainted with this rye fungus, and it would cause convulsions, hallucinations, body parts would turn black and actually fall off, and eventually people would die from it, and for years they didn't have any idea what was going on until they eventually discovered that it was from this fungus. And somehow natural healers of the time discovered that even though it could be deadly, if you used it in childbirth, it could hasten the contractions, hasten childbirth, and stop the bleeding afterwards. So for generations, this had been used by you know, in childbirth, and so Hofmann's boss at Sandoz, a guy named Arthur Stolz, began to experiment with this substance, and he discovered that the basic molecule that all the active parts of ergotamine was based on was something called lysergic acid. And so Hofmann's job when he got there was to start experimenting with this lysergic acid. And he started playing God, essentially, and combining it with different chemicals that he thought that maybe they might have an interesting use, medical use. And he did 24 of these things, and he found some useful compounds. And then he did the 25th one. And that was with, combined with diethylamide, which was derived from ammonia. And so he had the lysergic acid and the diethylamide, and the German word for acid begins with an S. And so what he had here was LSD, and it was the 25th compound that he tried. So this was LSD 25. And he synthesized this, and the guys in the lab were unimpressed. You know, it did have some kind of constriction of blood vessels, but not as good as some of the other compounds he'd come up with. They didn't find anything else that particularly attracted them. And they only noted in their lab notes that the animals they gave it to displayed sort of this odd restiveness for a few hours after they had given them the LSD 25. And so it just, you know, he'd been doing a lot of chemicals, and this was one they just said, it's no big deal. And yet, somehow, Hofmann couldn't stop thinking about LSD 25.